I am Reese Tisdale, and this is The Future of Water, which we talk about all the ways which companies, utilities, and people are addressing the challenges and opportunities in water. Today, we're going to be joined by John Berryman from Bluefield, as well as Eric Bendeler, to talk about key trends in water, from infrastructure investment to digital technologies. These perspectives that we're going to share with you today really stem from recent conversations with clients about things that we're looking at, particularly in the municipal water sector, not just now, but in the future. And so, like any time of the year, we oftentimes do it at the end of the year, but we thought, given the state of the world and what's happening now, would be a good time to talk about not just 2022, but even beyond, looking out towards 2025 and what some of the key factors are. So rather than hearing me make the introduction, let's get to the conversation.
All right, you guys, it's great to be back on the pod. Eric and Reese, good morning. How you guys doing?
Pretty good, John. How about yourself?
Pretty good. I'm currently dog sitting for my cousin's dog, who requested breakfast at about 5:30 this morning. So we'll see how that does for me for the rest of the week. It's a little bit earlier.
Feeling the pain. One more reason for my family, they should listen to this so they can be reminded why I don't want a dog.
Eric, speaking of dogs, how's your pup doing?
He's good. He's also, I thought that when daylight saving time kicked in, it would make him sleep in a little bit longer, but somehow he's still up and like ready to go at 6 a.m. So I feel your pain.
Well, let's jump into it then. So time and time again, we have clients come to us to discuss the higher level, wide sweeping trends that are influencing market conditions for water related investments and strategies. And recently, a client came to us asking about our thoughts on what they should consider, not just in the immediate term, but in the 3 to 5 year time frame. So rather than squirreling our thoughts away, I was hoping to take this opportunity to share some of your insights. You guys recently put pen to paper and presented your thoughts to a couple others. So while you put together a list of 6 big picture issues, there seemed to be a couple bigger takeaways. Reese, maybe we can start with you to kind of shed some light on those.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. Someone came to us asking sort of what are we thinking down the road as they sort of enhance or tweak their strategy going forward. And so quite honestly, Eric and I and the rest of the team sat down and kind of hashed it out. We go through this exercise periodically, usually at the end of the year as we look for the next year going forward, but also even beyond that. And one of the big, a couple points that came out of the discussion, and I think Eric and I will be happy to go through 6 points in particular that we kind of have laid out. But as a whole, there are a couple things that are of note. One, a lot of the changes or influence on the market are really not directly within the water or wastewater sector specifically. I mean, we've talked a fair amount about this, but really it's about customer shifts and demand. And that could be not only at the residential level, whether that be things like smart homes, more enhanced or better water management. We've put out a fair amount of research actually recently on the role of housing or property developers and construction firms implementing more enhanced water management systems into new build or new housing stock. And then the commercial side, commercial and industrial, I'll just go bigger than that. And that is things like ESG and corporate sustainability are taking on a whole nother, shifting into another gear is another way to put it. And water seems to be taking on a big role. So as these companies, implement these, they're going to be focused on water and they're going to be more efficient in their water management. The other is, I've talked a lot about this, is just the impact of energy. It's not just because energy prices are high these days, but the energy transition, I think, is real. Well, I know it's real, not only from natural gas or fossil fuels towards renewables. But then there are other things like storage and hydrogen that are on the horizon that not only influence the sourcing for utilities and where they're getting their power, but also I think part of this is it's really about decarbonization. And there seems to be a tightening or strengthening spotlight on water utilities themselves and how much energy they use and what their impact is. So the whole energy aspect is really interesting. And then lastly, I think the one thing that still stands out to me, while we seem to be moving on in the sense, in the case of Bluefield, going to conferences, having meetings. I'm actually traveling this afternoon to go to Indiana for a presentation to the Indiana State Bar Association. But have we really felt the full impact of COVID yet? And that would be financially. I know there's still workforce issues related to COVID and or other drivers, but I think that still, as we know, that takes a while to play out. So those are the 3 points. I would say customer shifts in demand, energy, and COVID, and that'll take a long-term rollout.
Yeah, Reese, and I think just to kind of build on that before we dig into kind of our 6 main medium-term trends that we wanted to call out. I think the interesting part of this conversation as we were going through this, together and in conversation with our client, it's the idea that a lot of these trends are really kind of external to the water industry, right? That water utilities, water, wastewater, stormwater utilities and communities are kind of having to respond to these varying shifts that are kind of external to the sector, trying to find ways to, be as proactive as possible, but also, obviously, deal with or kind of mitigate some of these changes or these challenges or these shifts, but also find opportunities right there. And we can get into this, but there are new opportunities for, new revenue or for better relationships with, residential and industrial clients as part of these changes. So I think that's what's really interesting is a lot of these themes, these kind of medium-term trends that we're going to be talking about are really kind of pressures that are coming from outside of the sector that are forcing utilities to respond in some way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, and I think in a lot of this, it doesn't all have to be negative, right? Things change. And so the question is, does the supply chain shift and do the utilities and industrial firms shift as well?
So that's a good segue, I think. Let's jump into the 6 items that we've identified. Reese, I'll start with you.
One is water quality. And that's not to say that water quality hasn't been a concern and a focus for a long time. In fact, it has, but there's certain aspects that are changing within that space, if you will, or theme. And that would be, emerging contaminants. Emerging contaminants are real. I think that, and that's been highlighted by what's happened with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, that quite honestly, there's $25 billion within that dedicated or allocated to PFAS and emerging contaminants, as well as lead. So with that being said, there seems to be real momentum that, quite honestly, 2 years ago, we didn't really see. There's been a lot of discussion about, post Flint, and then, the PFAS, it became real. We've been looking at that. I think there's 7 states with MCLs or maximum contaminant limits at this point. So, that list is going to continue to grow. And by 2025, there may be even, in fact, federal legislation. I think on the backside of that, also related to emerging contaminants, which is our biosolids. And I know that seems, I don't know, depending on who you are and how much insight you have into the water sector, but biosolids are used for other things. Wastewater plant produces a lot of biosolids, and in some cases it is reused for things like fertilizer, and their entire business model is built around this. And the question is there PFAS in those biosolids? And if that's the case, that could create a bigger issue. And that while there's been, like I mentioned, the 7 states with MCLs and movement towards federal legislation on drinking water, there hasn't been a lot of activity on the wastewater or biosolid side of the equation. That will take much longer. So I would say that if anything is over the horizon, that would be one, but it could ramp up given how much effort has been made recently. That could accelerate. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, definitely. And Eric, what I'm thinking is we can just alternate, of these six and go back and forth. But I don't know if you'll have a response to Reese's or if you want to move on to your next topic.
No, I mean, I guess I would just add that, I think water quality, as Reese mentioned, it's not a new challenge by any means or a new trend, but I think, and certainly it's a major topic of conversation, especially in the US. I mean, I think we'll try to reference some global perspectives as well, but certainly what we're seeing in the US is this really significant focus on lead as well as on PFAS right now. And I think, we're thinking about this in terms of the funding opportunities available right now, but it's going to take, several years to see all of this play out, to really find a way to address lead, to address emerging contaminants like PFAS. This is an issue that's going to be with us for some time, like it or not. And I think so when we're thinking about this from the, 3 to 5 year time horizon, for example, some of these challenges that are just starting to kind of surface more and more now, I think are really going to take a couple of years to play out, especially as Reese mentioned on the kind of wastewater on the biosolid side and what that means for some of those kind of alternative revenue streams that utilities have been able to develop in the agricultural sector.
I mean, quite honestly, one would think it would be in perpetuity where, water quality is an issue. It is the water we drink. It's the water we consume. And therefore, we shouldn't be sitting around waiting for a pandemic or a recession to, drive a focus and actually infrastructure spending on water quality. It seems a little crazy to me, but that seems to be the way politicians work. So there's my cynical point of the day. I'll leave it at that.
Appreciate it. Eric, take it away from there.
Yeah. So moving on. Moving on to point number 2 or to theme number 2 that we called out, and it ties in pretty closely to what we've just been discussing, but that would just be kind of the landscape for infrastructure funding. And again, this is, it's a short-term topic in the sense that it's very top of mind right now, but it's also something that, I think it's going to take 3 to 5 years at least to see the effects of this kind of current moment of infrastructure funding in the US in particular, but also around the world. I mean, in Europe and Australia and in other kind of key markets that we track, we're seeing this move to kind of post-COVID infrastructure stimulus funding, unprecedented amounts of money going into the industry. But there are just a lot of questions as to what the impact is actually going to be. And I think we're going to maybe, again, thinking in 3 to 5 years, we'll maybe have some more clarity around just how transformative these funding packages end up being. I mean, I think in the US in particular, we've all heard about the $55 billion that's going to the water sector, primarily through the EPA. We actually have an analyst here at Bluefield that's been going through the full IIJA, all of the different funding programs that have been kind of called out. And there's something like 104 individual line items or individual funding programs, about $133 billion total in funding that touches on water in some way. It may be a little bit more indirect. It may not be through the EPA. In fact, there's over a dozen different federal agencies that are administering this chunk of change. So a lot of money, I mean, unprecedented amount of money going into the water industry, into water infrastructure. But I think really the question that we have as we're thinking about, how this funding plays out over the next 3 to 5 years, which, 5 years coincidentally is kind of the time horizon for the IIJA, how effectively is that money actually going to be allocated? There's still all of these kind of uncertainties, these kind of clashes between, on the one hand, kind of federal priorities, right? Federal policy priorities, EPA policy priorities, Biden administration policy priorities, and then the actual kind of on the ground implementation. And there are a couple examples maybe that I can mention, and I know Reese will want to jump in here too. On the SRF side for the EPA, the majority of the water wastewater infrastructure money is going through the SRF, the State Revolving Fund program. We did a separate podcast on that a couple of weeks back. But you've got this kind of interesting dynamic between the EPA's priorities there. They want to really emphasize getting money to smaller communities, to disadvantaged communities, to environmental justice communities. They have an emphasis on kind of climate mitigation and adaptation. And that's all well and good. But, the money itself is actually administered by individual states, and states have their own frameworks for how they want to allocate the money. They have their own kind of policy priorities that may not align with a Democratic federal EPA. There's the kind of financial needs of the SRF itself. It's a loan program. It's a revolving loan program. And so, there's kind of an emphasis on that side and with the individual states on providing loans to larger utilities that are going to be able to pay those back, right? So there's kind of this clash between getting money to smaller communities and kind of the financial sustainability of the program, and at least in the minds of some of those state program administrators. So it's going to be really interesting to see that play out. There's also, and we could, spend a whole nother podcast on this. We probably will at some point, but the Buy America, Build America provisions of the IIJA on the federal side, there's this emphasis on domestic manufacturing. They've kind of greatly expanded the requirements that infrastructure projects receiving federal funding have to meet to try to really give a boost to domestic manufacturers, to domestic, suppliers, to domestic construction. But you marry that with, the kind of on the ground realities of actually getting these projects done, all the supply chain challenges that we're seeing, all of the inflation that we're seeing. There's going to be, a real kind of tension between meeting those policy priorities at a federal level and actually just getting the money out the door into projects and making an impact in communities. And I think as we think about the kind of 5-year time horizon for this funding, that's really the question is how effectively are utilities and state administrators and federal administrators going to be able to navigate those tensions and just get money into communities and make an impact.
Yeah, I mean, the one quick thing I would add is the Buy American legislation will be interesting to watch as it unfolds. And I know there's a big deadline, the middle of May, that we're watching closely, and we've dug into it to the extent there's information and details about it now. But yeah, you're exactly right. And the reason while they're talking about it now, the reason we think about it longer term is, if you're looking at 75% of manufactured goods or inputs into a project need to be American made, that's a big jump from, the 55% for a limited set of items now. So that's why there is real concern, and that could have long-term implications. The second point, and I think this is what Eric touched upon, is there's probably no worse time in the history of the world to try to drive American-made products when inflation is so high. It's a tough time to make that argument, but history of the world might be strong. I'll admit it, but little hyperbole never hurts.
It is seemingly adding insult to injury at that point.
Exactly.
Well, just in the interest of time, Reese, let's talk about our next theme that we're looking at 3 to 5 years down the road.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one would be just alternative sources of water. We've talked a fair amount about desalination historically. A lot of that really is outside of the U.S., but within the U.S., what we are looking more closely at and have been for a long time is things like wastewater reuse or water reuse, depending on how you want to frame it as far as branding goes. But within that, I think, there has been a big focus, and for good reason, on places on the Western U.S. That's where the droughts seem to happen. That's where the water scarcity is. It currently doesn't look any better. So that makes sense. But what we're also starting to see is there is a movement east, and there are not only there are drivers for this, things like overdrawing groundwater supplies or sources. We're seeing that in places like Long Island, but we're also, we've seen it in Florida. So you think things like saltwater intrusion become a real problem for utilities and their water supplies. And that is going to drive more reuse systems, maybe in larger ones, but also because of things like ESG or corporate sustainability again. So I mentioned, they're driving reuse as well, and that's really going to be more on site. So what does that mean? What it means is as individual facilities and maybe even ultimately residences begin deploying reuse at greater scale, there is an impact on the utility, and it's not just water revenues, it's also the concentrations of wastewater that are flowing into the utility or wastewater system are therefore greater, and there are financial and operational implications for that. So, while we're talking mostly about municipal, as I started off early on, different externalities are reshaping or will reshape how utilities are managing their water systems. I would just stick with those two main points. I think, we're big believers in reuse because it makes sense, quite honestly. And there are a lot of opportunities, and it's complicated. I get it, because you have a lot of stakeholders. One, not only where is it being treated, who's doing it, but then also are there off takers for that reclaimed or reused water? And so I'd say, that's what I would focus on.
Eric, any thoughts on that before we move on to another topic?
Yeah, I mean, I just, I think I would echo that the revenue impact for utilities. I mean, this is something that we've kind of been talking about for a while. If you've seen any of us present at a conference, you've probably seen this slide that we like to show. That it's a US focused slide, but I think some of the trends apply pretty globally as well, where, you see, US population from the 1950s compared to water consumption, right? And you see that they've grown, pretty much in tandem, pretty predictably, pretty kind of linear relationship between water consumption and population growth until about 2005 or so. And then the population line keeps going up and the consumption line starts to go down, right? The water kind of supply volume starts to go down. And this plays into it as we're thinking about alternative water, especially on kind of the industrial side. We're thinking about more on-site treatment, on-site reuse, industrial and commercial players kind of developing their own alternative decentralized sources of water. It's going to continue to drive that trend where utilities, they're not selling as much water. They're not providing as much kind of wastewater treatment services. Obviously, from a conservation, environmental stewardship perspective, that's a good thing, but it's also really challenging for kind of the utility business model. And it's driving this need for utilities to consider other sources of revenue, kind of alternative revenue streams. And I think we'll get into that a little bit more in our next couple themes.
Reese, anything to add?
No, I think, when it comes to that, I mean, I agree with Eric. I mean, like I said, I'm, one point to round out the revenue impacts. It's not just, it's happened before, right? If, and we're seeing it happen now as industrial, commercial, residential users become more efficient in their water usage. And that could just be by new appliances, right? I mean, that's better fixtures. Water utilities have already had to resize pipes, right? Drinking water distribution pipe networks, because, you can't have excess capacity. So there is a financial cost to that, not just in revenues alone, but also just in CapEx, where you have to basically rehab a system to address the shift.
Pretty interesting. Eric, let's go on to the next one.
Yeah. So number 4 of our, 3 to 5 year trends is really the kind of the energy transition, as Reese called out at the beginning of the conversation here. I mean, I think when we have talked about the climate impact or kind of climate change and its relationship to the global utility sector, I think we've really kind of framed us, and I think the conversation has really framed utilities kind of as victims in a lot of ways of climate change, right? As if we're thinking about drought and the impacts on managing a community's water system and scarce water resources. If we think about the impacts of too much precipitation and what that does in terms of managing stormwater and wastewater outfalls and flooding and that kind of thing, we've kind of thought of utilities as responding to climate impacts. But I think the conversation really, in maybe the past year or so, in particular, has really shifted more to recognizing the contributions that utilities make to global greenhouse gas emissions, right? I think we've seen the stat floated around that, overall the global water wastewater sector accounts for about 2% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, which it's not a huge share by any means, but it is a significant share. And if we're thinking about, if we're talking about significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050, it's kind of all hands on deck, right? And the utility sector needs to do what they can to reduce their own footprint, especially, carbon is one thing. And there's a lot of kind of carbon dioxide burned to pump water and wastewater around the world, but also methane. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. It's about 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year time horizon. And wastewater treatment is one of the leading emitters of methane around the world. Maybe, 10 to 15% of global methane emissions, I believe, come from the wastewater treatment sector. So a lot of things that utilities can do to kind of green their own operations, whether it be in optimizing their treatment and their pump operations, in just shifting more to renewable energy to power their own operations, to EV fleets, digital technology, just to kind of better monitor and manage resources. And I think we're seeing more and more of that recognition that this is another driver that utilities are going to have to take seriously, admittedly more in places like Europe and Australia and New Zealand than in the US. I think we've seen, there's a coalition of 20 something utilities in the UK and in Australia and New Zealand that have committed to kind of net zero targets by 2050. We're not seeing quite as much, outspoken commitments from the US utility sector for the most part. But I do think, again, as we're thinking 3 to 5 years down the line, that conversation is going to be stronger. The pressure that utilities face is going to be stronger to really kind of take this challenge on and reduce their emissions footprint.
Yeah, I mean, I'd follow up with that, and you actually laid out a lot there, Eric. And I think there are policies moving into place for energy capture, like you said, Australia, Europe, New Zealand. That's kind of a crazy order, but as far as countries go, jumping around the world. But the reality of it is, in the U.S. and places like California, Vermont, we're starting to see policies to either legislate or drive anaerobic digestion, which therefore gases can be captured. And we're also seeing it on the competitive side. I mean, I've talked a fair amount about, particularly with Dave McGimsey, but also the convergence of the critical infrastructure players. So when someone like NW natural gas service provider out of the Pacific Northwest, they're now a water player. They own utilities in various spots around the country. They're looking at biogas capture at their wastewater facilities, and there are reasons for that, whether it be portfolio balancing across the because of their own climate footprint or carbon footprint. So there are reasons for that. We see new players like NextEra getting involved. Then, I've talked a fair amount about things like hydrogen, but, it's just because there's hydrogen power, there's got to be a water supply. We've talked a little bit about reuse. We've looked at places like Australia where, wastewater utilities may have a clean, at least reliable water source for water feedstock to electrolyzers for things like green hydrogen. So this is all happening. This is an area that I'm really excited about. I know even back to the IIJA, also things like, the federal loan guarantee program, which has been reinstated. I think they just gave a $500 million or so loan guarantee to hydrogen facility in Utah, the ACES plant, which is, I think, the ultimate goal. It's on top of some salt domes, and so they can store the hydrogen there. But also the water supply in this case is actually, they're just taking the rights from what used to be a coal plant and converting it towards hydrogen. But it's also in the middle of Utah. And so I know what I've looked at is sort of, when it comes to its water footprint, that may work there in the current situation, given the state of the world. But, as climate and other pressures squeeze things like water rights, water availability, then the calculus may change a bit. So there's a lot happening, I think, if anything. So I'm really excited to see how it all unfolds.
Well, Reese, let's stick with you and move on to our fifth called out theme here.
Yeah, I mean, good segue, right? So infrastructure convergence, I talked a little bit about critical infrastructure players, whether it be gas, power, renewables, getting into the water sector. Even in the case of Aqua America, the investor in water utility, they just merged with People's Gas in Pennsylvania. So there's coming back around. It's been a long time. RWE, the German water utility, they used to own, American a while back, several decades ago now. And then, we've got energy players in the space again. They are acquiring assets. So they have different perspectives on where the opportunities are. I think, the other big question is, when it comes to infrastructure convergence more broadly, is, coming from just our conversation about energy, and that is, they're not a lot of power utilities. If you think about it, you're looking at like 3,300 or so in the US. Well, in the US for water, you're looking at, 50,000 water, another 15, 20 wastewater. So you're talking, the fragmentation is massive. And many of the problems and challenges, quite honestly, while they don't make the headlines like the Pittsburghs or the Baltimores of the world, the smaller ones, there's, tens of thousands of very small systems that are providing, reliable water and wastewater treatment. But the challenge is they're under greater regulatory pressure. We talked a little bit about like emerging contaminants, and that will continue to expand and grow. The problems, things aren't static, is a better way to put it. So there is consolidation happening. I mean, this past year, we saw over 200 utility acquisitions in the US, but, that's, and they're mostly small systems, like 65% of them, maybe 70% of them are pretty small. So that should continue to grow and accelerate with the combination of stresses on the utilities, but also new players in the market, competition to do so, and a potential need. And I'm not advocating for privates or publics. I mean, it's just consolidation as a whole. And then I think also part of that is, as we've seen in COVID, but even we see it now, and that is tight labor markets. I mean, workforce constraints on utilities are an underlying driver, not only in brain drain with people retiring, but also just infrastructure is just getting more complex. I mean, Eric can speak to the digitization of assets and asset management, but also it's just far more complicated than it used to be based on what we know. So that's going to accelerate the role of, third-party players as well. So it's already happening in some cases.
And Eric, you and I have both been at both of the utility management conferences this year in Atlanta and Orlando. I think that labor aspect is definitely something that's been a pretty common theme at both conferences. But why don't we actually move it on with that segue over into the digital aspect of where everything's going?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, John. So this one was tricky. I mean, I think, if we're thinking 3 to 5 years is actually a really long time in the digital space. We could easily pick, 5 or 6 different trends, even just within kind of the digital segment alone, especially when you think about technology, right? I mean, I think, generally we're going to continue to see really interesting new applications, new use cases for all kinds of, emerging technologies that are being developed in other industries or other parts of the economy. So, AI, augmented reality, robotics, even blockchain. We're talking to some really interesting startups that are trying to figure out ways to apply blockchain to water, right? So on the technology side, there's no shortage of changes. I think that we're going to see new startups, new VC funding. Those trends are going to continue certainly, and get stronger. I would say over the next 3 to 5 years. But what we really wanted to call attention to for this, and the kind of theme that we settled on was really more in terms of adoption, in terms of kind of the democratization of digital technology. As Reese alluded to, in the US, and our listeners will be well aware of this, the utility sector is extremely fragmented. I was looking at the numbers. I'm in the middle of a global digital water forecast and looking at kind of global utility numbers, and there's about 400,000 global utility water, wastewater providers around the world in the markets that we're looking at. Only about 1.5% of those serve more than 100,000 people. Nearly 80% serve fewer than 5,000 people, right? And it's a huge difference in terms of the kind of the financial capacity, the budget to bring on new technology, the internal capacity to actually use and manage and understand these technologies, or have the time to, go look for vendors for a new metering system or new, AI-based predictive analytics, right? I mean, there's a really big difference between a large, urban utility that's got a dedicated IT department, maybe even a dedicated kind of digital innovation team, and a small rural operator that maybe has 1 or 2 part-time treatment plant operators, and that's kind of their water department, right? There's major difference in kind of financial and staffing capacity. And so when we think about the future, kind of the mid to long term evolution of the digital water market, we're going to need to see more adoption at the lower end of the scale. We're going to need to see vendors really find ways of getting technology into the hands of those smaller operators, because again, there's only so much market at the higher end of the scale. There's only so many utilities, that serve millions or hundreds of thousands of people that can buy SCADA systems and AI and IoT devices. There's a limit to that market, right? It gets saturated relatively quickly. And so what we're going to need to see is new business models, new technologies, new price points, just new marketing strategies that are really targeted at finding ways to make this technology accessible to smaller utilities. And I think that, we've done some analysis of this in the past, but I think, cloud and software as a service is a really helpful starting point. We are seeing greater ability to adopt technology by leveraging the cloud, by leveraging software as a service, taking more of that burden of operating the technology, and also just reducing the kind of upfront capex burden on smaller utilities. And so that's been helpful, but I think there's still a long way to go. And we're seeing it. I mean, I do think we're seeing, in my conversations with the industry, I'm hearing about more and more new market entrants that are really targeted specifically on that kind of mid-tier utility range, or even smaller utilities. And even some of the larger, more established players, the kind of digital water incumbents, I think are recognizing too that market is running out at the top, and they need to find ways of kind of scaling down to the lower end of the scale. So again, when I think about what's really going to change the face of the digital water market over the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be that. It's going to be that kind of democratization of the technology.
Yeah, I think the opportunity for disruption is massive. And I think we all kind of geek out about it offline, but it's fun to broadcast and let our listeners kind of in on where we see things heading down the road. Reese, do you have any final comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, everybody, it is, I would say, cracking that part of the industry to small municipal water systems is huge. Everybody's looked at it. I mean, in industrial as well, people look at industrial, and kind of is a similar problem in the sense of its own fragmentation in both respects. But also, and so, a deal, how can you go from system to system? Someone's got to go door to door ultimately, right? And so scaling it is not easy. Everybody's looking for the white whale, and it's not always that way. So unlocking that would be huge. And, on the back end, the cybersecurity issues are real, or maybe overstated, quite honestly, in some respects. And so I know Eric is about to embark with others on some analysis of the role of cloud computing in the water sector, and how that plays into cybersecurity risks. Is it better or worse than where we are today? And I think there are a lot of reasons to say it actually could be better. So,
Eric, any final thoughts?
No, that's absolutely right. And just as a plug, we just released, I think earlier this week, a new research note on the cybersecurity landscape. There's really interesting kind of policy developments, again, looking around the world, certainly within the US, within IIJA and elsewhere. We've seen a greater focus on cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and especially for water. The Biden administration has a 100-day cybersecurity for water utility action plan, and there's kind of buckets of money carved out within IIJA. But as we look kind of globally, we're seeing some interesting trends too, and interesting funding support from the European Union. Chinese utilities are requiring their critical infrastructure operators to dedicate 10% of their IT budgets to cybersecurity, things like that. Just really interesting policy trends and different approaches, but generally, I think we're seeing more focus on this. Which is really important, because obviously the more that utilities are investing in digital technology, the more kind of attack services they're creating, and to be able to have that capacity to kind of manage those risks while harvesting or reaping the benefits of digitization, that's really going to be critical. And obviously not a new trend. I mean, something we've been talking about. The conversation has really, I think, ramped up over the past year or two, with more people working from home during COVID, with major kind of high profile attacks like Oldsmar. And then now certainly with kind of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and all the concerns about cyber disruption stemming from that. So definitely a trend that we're going to be continuing to follow over the next 3 to 5 years and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we're wrapping it up. It sounds like. So one thing I would add is like the cough drop business is back in play. Three of us have colds, and we're all in 3 completely different locations that we're fighting. So maybe we should reach out to Ricola for sponsorship.
That would be an awesome sponsor.
And it's been hopefully I don't have one. I'm like right on the edge. I can feel it, but I know why. I'm blaming you, John, because I saw you last week.
Yeah, I'm not even going to say it. I've just about finally kicked mine, but Eric seems to just started his cold, so everybody gets a turn.
Exactly. 2 years in the making. So forgot what it was like.
Well, guys, that was a lot of fun. I appreciate the time and always love hearing you both just kind of go off on where everything's headed, see things headed down the road. So thanks, Eric. Thanks, Reese.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks, John. My pleasure. This is great. Thanks, guys. This has been The Future of Water. So before we sign off, please subscribe and give us a review, or just download the podcast because it helps us understand who's listening and when, where, and how they're listening. Send us a note to waterexperts@bluefieldresearch.com with any topic ideas you would like us to discuss. We're doing this for you. And lastly, tell a friend about it. Everybody's looking for something to listen to, I think, whether it be in the car and on the train now as people start getting back into the office. This podcast and these water industry insights have been brought to you by Bluefield Research. To learn more about us, visit us at bluefieldresearch.com. Until we talk again, be well, be safe, and take care.